When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the dreaded Nightfort. This is one of my favorite locations in all of A Song of Ice and Fire. I maybe should have saved this topic for Halloween week, but I really wanted to dive into this one. It's another really mysterious place where we have a lot more detail on it than, say, the Isle of Faces, and I've been kind of getting into wanting to talk about some of the different locations in A Song of Ice and Fire that piques my interest, and we'll just see. If you guys want to see more of this, feel free to let me know down in the comments. But we're going to go through the history of the Nightfort, some of the rumors, the dreaded 13th Lord Commander being the Night's King. This is the kind of the alleged figure that the show did, but here it's very different. And we'll spend a lot of time on that character, specifically what was going on at that point, speculating, and the inevitable fall of the Nightfort and its current state in the normal story. We don't necessarily have a great picture of when it was starting to be built and everything along those lines, but here's what we do know. We know that it is the oldest castle on the wall, but it had been rebuilt allegedly multiple times. This comes from sources from the Maesters, and I think this makes sense. Given the way that the Night's Watch, over the early years of being formed as a group, they would have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and so the Nightfort would have had to go through multiple constructions, adding different parts. You think about just the dungeons, and we're going to talk about that as well. It was able to hold 500 men. I mean, think about Castle Black. It's nowhere near the size of the Nightfort. So the Nightfort is interesting because it really is, I believe, the origin of where the Night's Watch was founded, in terms of if it is their first castle, like we're told, it would be where likely the Lord Commander would have ruled. But we'll talk about that here in a second. I also want to talk about a little bit of its construction. What do we know about the Nightfort in terms of what it has there and all of that? In its current state, we've only been to the Nightfort one time with Samwell and Bran in A Storm of Swords, and so most of the information we have regarding its current condition and what it had, especially in its prime, comes from that chapter. We know that the deep stone vaults remain from its original form, but everything else basically has decayed and has become basically a shell of its former self. It contained towers that are now broken and crumbling, a vast maze beneath the castle of tunnels and vaults, almost similar to like the Red Keep. It's kind of how I think about it for the most part, in terms of having a lot of these different tunnels, and it would make sense given, it is the deep north. The winters are going to be extremely cold. These tunnels are going to be extremely valuable for not having to go outside or all those kind of things. Notable buildings that we know: it had a bell tower, a rookery, a brew house, an emptied library, a dungeon that held up to 500 prisoners, a bathhouse, an armory, and a forge. Think about all these things that it has. Even Castle Black doesn't have some of these things. And the dungeons, I think, are very important. The Night's Watch having a dungeon that can hold up to 500 prisoners is very interesting, given, when would you ever need that? Given the Night's Watch's purpose of it being the defenders against the others, and as time went on, it became predominantly the wildlings. When would you come to a circumstance where you need to have 500 men imprisoned? And that's just telling you that the Nightfort, in a lot of ways, is kind of similar to Harrenhal, where it's just monstrously big. And for the Night's Watch, it seems almost a bit too extravagant that you needed all these different huge places when the Night's Watch just doesn't necessarily need it. And that's one thing that becomes more and more obvious. As the Night's Watch starts to decline, you can't really maintain a dungeon that is so big it can house 500 men. You don't have the builders to be able to keep up with making sure the castle is maintained. And that's the issue you run into with the Nightfort, is it very much feels like Harrenhal. Harrenhal and the Nightfort are extremely similar. They're two castles that, as time has gone on, they've pretty much festered and become shells of their former selves. And as time has gone on, the people that do occupy them don't even utilize the entire castle. They usually utilize very small parts, or the central parts, or the most necessary parts of the castle. Also, I did forget to mention, it also has an armory and a forge, of course. And it also had a great hall that was rat infested with only one wall left standing. And then the kitchen, which is the most prominent part of it that we see through Bran's POV, is a stone octagon with a domed roof and a stepped well that leads into this mysterious gate. And it's very much apparent that by the time we see the Night's Fort in the normal story, nature has pretty much taken over. There are yards that are turned into small forests, a weirwood that grows through the kitchen roof, trees sprouting in the stables. It is a symbol of abandonment and decay, and it really is that nature has taken over. And it's that kind of that idea a little bit that I find fascinating of nature always wins out. It's one of the main themes of like the Jurassic Park franchise, or I guess I should really just say the first one. The other one's, that's a whole different conversation, but it's the same idea. And so the Night's Fort really paints this picture of not only is it abandoned by the time Bran and Samwell go there, it is a lot more in terms of it has some of these rumors. It has a lot of mysterious things about it. It seems to be the only one of these castles that has a gate that's magical that allows someone to pass through it, as we talk about the wall and the gate. So outside of the magical gate, we also see that there was a ground level gate through the wall, similar to Castle Black, but it had been sealed with frozen stone and rubble. Now, we're never actually told when that actually happens. I'm going to speculate towards the end of the video when I believe this probably happened, but for right now, all you need to know is there was a main gate, and that makes a ton of sense. If this was where the Night's Watch originated, well, you would have to have some way of being able to range, and so this place obviously had a gate. But the interesting thing is, why is there a hidden, secret black gate, which is told to be as old as the wall itself? This to me is very weird to me, because why would you need a second gate? And it becomes very apparent that this gate is here for different reasons. And you specifically think about how the 13th Commander probably used that gate. It is very suspicious. But if the gate is as old as the wall itself, it means it predates the Night's King, or the 13th Lord Commander. That means it had been there, long before that point. But the other thing that I think is interesting is how many people knew about this gate in terms of when the Night's Fort was being built. Did people know about this gate? And it seems like it doesn't, because we know that this completely falls out of history. Nobody knows about this gate, really. Like, Bran doesn't know that it was there. Sam didn't know it was there. This Cold Hands figure did. And so that really is interesting, because is it a gate that is supposed to be a secret between maybe the Children of the Forest and the Men of the Night's Watch, but only that secret is maybe transferred to each different Lord Commander? They're given knowledge of that gate for their own personal uses, maybe? Who knows? That's a question we still don't have answered, and I do think we will get it answered at some point, but I do find that to be fascinating, that this well is used as the entry point to a second gate. We also do know that the gate is quite magical, as you have to be part of the Night's Watch to get through, but also the gate seems to have enchantments on it as well, so it's very different than all the other gates that we've seen in the story. So let's then go into the legacy, the history of the Night's Fort, detailing every time it has been referenced within the story. So like I said earlier, the Night's Fort is the oldest by far of the castles on the wall, over double the age of Castle Black itself, along with the castle is known to be the largest. Now, one thing I really want to point to is I think Castle Black was made almost as a direct result because of the Night Fort. The Night Fort is kind of different than a lot of the other castles on the wall, because it serves as a point of, it is an actual castle. Like, it is something that is defensible. It is something where when you have the 13th Lord Commander, he can declare himself a king and all that kind of stuff. You could never do that at Castle Black because, well, it's not a castle. It says it's Castle Black, but it really is just a formation of buildings and all that kind of stuff. The wall is the castle part of it, and the gate itself. So I think Castle Black is really interesting, because in a lot of ways, I think it being made is a direct result of the Night Fort. Also, Castle Black being centralized between the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch is also another point. From an early point, the Night Fort seemed to be the place where the Lord Commander would reign, different than Castle Black, as it would come much later. I talked about this a little bit earlier on, but just given it is the oldest, it had to have been where the Night's Watch reigned for a good amount of time until the other castles started to spring up. If you also want to go a little bit further as we delve into the Night's King, as really we don't have any information on to any of the Lord Commanders or anything going on at the Night's Fort before this point. The Night's King himself had been a Lord Commander, and he had been at the Night's Fort, so that makes the most sense that early on in the reign of the Night's Watch, this is where they made their capital, so more or less, or the place where the Lord Commander reigned. So that gets us to the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. We do not know his name. We do not know his family titles. We don't know anything really about him as a person. But we can say this: he is known to be the Night's King, which is very interesting. Given the Nightfort, he becomes the king of it. It makes a ton of sense. But the first thing we do hear about the Night's King is that he fell in love with a strange woman. While on top of the wall, he saw a woman with skin white as the moon, eyes like blue stars, and she was cold as ice itself. This is very much alleged to be a other, or a woman from the White Walkers. And this is what I'll say about this. Because this is so far in the past, and because apparently all the stories of this tale were scraped from the histories, it's interesting that we still have rumors and speculation. And if this is the case, it's interesting because the Night's King becomes somebody that formed an alliance, it would appear, with the others, because this happens after the Long Night. So this would have been the 13th Lord Commander. Maybe this is like 100-ish years after the formation of the Night's Watch. The problem with trying to speculate on the 13th Lord Commander is we don't know how long, people reigned for. So for instance, Jeor Mormont reigned for a little while. You're going to see Jon has reigned for a little while. It's kind of like the Targaryen kings in a lot of ways. Like some Targaryen kings reigns last maybe 30 years. Maybe another one lasts only a couple of years. Some even last maybe a year or two. That's kind of the same thing with the Lord Commander. So if you just average it all out, maybe this is about 100-ish years since the Long Night occurred. And the real question you have to ask yourself is, if this is an other, why did they come so close into proximity of the wall? And that's something I really question. Because if you also think then, how did she get through the wall? Did she come through the main gate with the Night's King? Did he just allow her that way? Is it the fact that they used the magical gate? Because here's the other part of this. If we go off of the idea that the others cannot pass through the wall, well then if this woman was an other, how did she get through the wall? Does the magic gate allow for that to occur? Or is this woman not an other at all, but maybe she's a half other, or maybe something along those lines? There's a lot here that we don't have a lot of information on, but we can speculate on a ton, because something here seems to be missing, because we're told these through like old Nan tales, and Bran's the one that kind of recollects a lot of this stuff. How do we ever really know what is the case when it's been scrapped from the histories? We're going off of a lot of rumors. And so for my opinion, given the fact that we've never seen a woman like other White Walker, I believe possibly she could be like a half breed or something along those lines. There's something that is significantly different about the Night King's queen. But like I just alleged, the Night King would make her his queen. But for the next 13 years, the Night's Watch would be bound under his will with sorcery. Now, this is what I find to be really interesting, because the first question you have to ask is, how did he rule for 13 years, declaring himself a king with this queen that seems mysterious? And the Night's Watch as a whole, why did they follow the Night's King? And the thing I would look at is, think about the Night's Watch. It's in its infancy years, and it's still not a very established organization. A lot of the men that are maybe coming to the Night's Watch might have even, thought, hey, why are we defending against the others? The Long Night is over. And they might not even understand what the Night King's queen is. She could maybe not be another. Maybe she was something of a half-breed or something along those lines. And so the real question begins here is, how did the Night's King keep them under his own will and his power? Did he just say, screw the Night's Watch vows, we're just going to act like our own kingdom. You guys can take wives. You don't have to follow the rules of the Night's Watch. Any of that kind of stuff. But then if that is the case, why was the Night King not dealt with until 13 years later? Or were people trying to, but they were failing? Or is it the idea that people were not willing to go against him for fear of what the Night King had power-wise? Or maybe it was a mixture of, we were in winter, And so maybe the Starks were waiting till after winter passed to deal with the Night King, or maybe there was a civil war going on in the north. It just seems extremely odd that the Night's King was allowed to rule for 13 years. We're told that during this point he committed unspeakable atrocities. It would later be discovered that he was allegedly making sacrifices to the others, which is another thing that's interesting, is when he was sacrificing to the others, was it similar to what Craster was doing? Like, was he having babies be sacrificed, likely through sending them out of the Black Gate? Or was it he was sending them full-grown men? Or what was going on there? And could it have been the Night's King and also his queen were having, like, babies? And so if his queen was a half other, half whatever, and then also adding in, a human into that, and then having these children that become part of the others, it could be so interesting, because if this is a Stark, now we don't know the identity of the Night's King, but if this is a Stark, it becomes so interesting, because then the Starks and the others would share the same blood. And that would be really interesting. Given the fact that I believe Benjen Stark has become a prisoner of the others, this would kind of explain maybe why he wasn't killed, and maybe why there is that interest in him because of his blood being related to the others. We don't know. Again, this is all speculation, but we do know that he was overthrown when Brandon the Breaker, the king in the north at the time, and Jorman, the king beyond the wall, united against him. So I want you guys to think about this. The situation was so bad with the Night's King that the wildlings and the forces of the north had to unite to destroy the Night's King. That tells you a lot about the dire situation that the north felt it was in, that they reached out and made an alliance with the wildlings. Now, how would the wildlings even factor in on this as well? Like, how did that even come to be? Because you would think if the wildlings are getting in on this, well, they can't really attack anything outside of just attacking the gate at the Knight's Fort. So was it idea of the wildlings attacked the gate just to distract the Night King's forces while the North rallied their forces and hit them at the same time? We just don't know. But this moment, I believe, is predominantly why we would then see later on Castle Black. Because this is one of those moments where the Night's King became like his own power in the North. And you also got to be thinking, if he was sacrificing babies to the others, if it wasn't from him and his queen, that also means that the men at the Night's Watch were breaking their vows. They were, having children. They were sleeping with women, all that kind of stuff. Maybe they were getting married, all that kind of stuff. We just don't know. And so the Night's King's reign is by far the most interesting part of the Night's Fort's history, but it would not be the last, as the fallout would be his own death and the discovery that he had been making sacrifices to the others. All records of him were erased, and his true name was forbidden and forgotten. But many speculate on him being related to one of the northern houses. It would seem most likely, just given the fact that the North spends a lot more investment into the Night's Watch, especially at this point, like the Starks would go there. It would be natural for a lot of the other northern houses to go there. Maybe he was a Bolton. That could be really interesting. But this ended the reign of the Night's King. But what really is interesting is that even though it was told that his name would be basically deleted from history, his legacy still passed through word of mouth, more or less. Or maybe people wrote down these tales but just kept them away. And so that even, thousands of years after this, we still have the general story of what happened. Now, could that all not be true, and could that have been played up? Yes. But it is interesting that of all of the history that has survived the Nightfort, it was this. It just tells you that there was something going on here that I think we'll probably find out more in the future. And that's enough on the Night's King. This whole video is supposed to be about the Nightfort, and so I wanted to bring up the Night's King, but I didn't want to spend a whole video on it. So moving on, we have some other rumors that we're going to loosely talk about, but I won't dive into them nearly as much as I did for the Night's King. We have the Rat Cook, who served an Andal King, his own son, baked in a pie. This allegedly could be Tywell II Lannister or Oswell I Arryn. We also see the 79 sentinels, men that were entombed in the wall for desertion, standing eternal watch. We have Dany Flint, who is a brave girl that was sexually assaulted and murdered at the Nightfort. We have King Sherritt's curse, which called doom upon the invading Andals. We had, it seemed like a hazing going on with the thing that came in the night, as apprentice boys were forced to face it in the Nightfort. This one, I think, is honestly a nice little spin on the idea of you must face your fear. So whatever you believe to be in the Nightfort is what you must stand up against. And so if you believe that that's going to be, the rat cook or whatever the rumors are of the Nightfort of ghosts and all these things, maybe the others, I think it's more to do with just hazing, more or less. But who knows on that one. We have Simon Starrise, the blind knight who apparently saw hellhounds fight here. And then lastly, we have Maddox, who was a haunted figure who roams the yards and towers, murdering in the dark. So what does all this mean? How many of these are actually true? We don't know. And I think a lot of this seems to spew from the awful reputation that the Night's Fort has. I believe, honestly, that the Night's King is the most believable of all of these, and that some of these other ones were played up and they were building off the legacy of the Night's Fort. So similar to Harrenhal, where like Harrenhal is infested with these ghosts and all of this stuff of Harren and his sons, and everybody dreads Harrenhal and they make stories about it that maybe aren't even necessarily true. Like there might be scientific reasons as to why you're hearing weird sounds and the structure of Harrenhal, but there also is just that legacy there. And I think that in a lot of ways the Night's Fort suffers from the same thing, albeit I think all of these things could definitely have happened. Like the 79 Sentinels makes sense. Like all of this makes sense. And I think all of it is to set the precedent of the Nightfort and the reputation that it gained after this point of the Night's King. And so I think all of this builds into why Castle Black became the real capital of the Wall where the Lord Commander would stay. It's because the Nightfort had such a bad reputation. It was apparently haunted and it had all these curses and all this stuff about it that on face value, you wouldn't have wanted to rule there anyway. And I think a lot of the Night's Watchmen would have not enjoyed being there. And also, I think it has the fact that they were probably pressured and they probably looked into themselves as well and said, we're not supposed to take part in the conflicts of Westeros, so why are we building a castle that defends from the other houses south of the wall? And that's what Castle Black is. Castle Black is a complete and utter opposite of the Nightfort. Whereas the Nightfort is a defensible position, it is more of a castle than it is like a little town, more or less, and that's what Castle Black is. It's like a little cluster of buildings. Not little, it's still quite big, but it's a cluster of buildings is what it is. That is the reason I think Castle Black is the way it is. So that then gets us into the decline of the Nightfort. About 300 years before Aegon's conquest, the men of the Nightfort and Snowgate apparently went to war. Eventually, both commanders lost their heads to a Stark. So this is really important to understand. Again, it's the same beat that I talked about earlier with the Night's King, what we just got done saying. The Nightfort seems to be a place where, if given enough power, people will say, why don't we just become our own little kingdom? And I think that maybe was not what was happening here, but the fact that Nightfort and Snowgate go to war is incredibly interesting. What is this over? Is this over resources? Was it over desperation? Maybe there was a harsh winter that was going on that was leading to starvation, and so the people of Snowgate and the men of Nightfort went to war over that. Was it something more? Was it bad leadership that was going on at the time? Was there corruption going on? Either way, it just builds the sense of, why is it always the Nightfort that bad things happen on the Night's Watch, of them breaking their vows, turning on their brothers? We don't know, because there is literally no information on this conflict at all. It is pure speculation. And it just kind of proves into the idea that Castle Black was needed because of conflicts like what was happening between the Nightfort and Snowgate. Some point after this, Arson Isaacs then tried to tunnel under the wall, but was found by rangers of the Nightfort, who decided to seal him in the wall. The legend is that if you put your ear to the wall, you can hear his axe. So another brutal action. And it really just is just to symbolize how brutal and cruel the men of the Night's Watch could be. They could have just as easily killed Arson Isaacs by just killing the guy, but they didn't. They chose to seal him in, which is a much worse fate. Over the coming years, in the beginning of the Targaryen reign, the Night Fort had become a shell of itself, with 3/4 of the fort not being used / manned, and was costly to maintain. So it is an even more extreme than Castle Black. Whereas, like, for instance, Castle Black is largely not used as it used to be. Jon thinks about that as soon as he gets there. We really get to see him thinking about that in A Storm of Swords when he returns and they're preparing for the battle for the wall, more or less. It's really interesting because the Night Fort has that happen before Castle Black. Castle Black does not decline at the same time that the Night Fort does, and the Night's Watch declines steadily through the years, but it has like almost a steep decline during the Aegon taking over in the Targaryen dynasty. But it also makes sense just given the reputation the Night Fort had and how costly it was to maintain. It just wasn't worth it at this point. And the only reason I believe men were even stationed at the Night Fort was because of its gate. And so I think that is the purpose of it, is that the Night Fort over time, because of its reputation, because of Night's Watch leadership likely realizing the situation of putting a lot of men in the Night Fort did not lead to great outcomes. There were multiple points at which it had led to rebellion and it had led to people declaring themselves as king. It's not a good castle, and that reputation seemed to continue over. But the Night Fort would still continue on until the year of 58 AC, when good Queen Alysanne would visit the castle and found it unpleasant and recommended abandoning it for a new castle, which would be known as Deep Lake, 7 miles to the east, which the Night's Watch paid with Alysanne's jewels. We would see Deep Lake in A Storm of Swords as well, but this would spell the end of the Night Fort, and I believe Alysanne was right to suggest them to move away from the Night Fort. It was a cursed place. It was a place that, again, was just not realistic in terms of trying to man it, similar to Harrenhal. And so the men of the wall would abandon it, and at some point the gate would be sealed. I believe this likely could have happened when they were abandoning the castle in 58 AC, but it also could have been in the years leading up to this moment, just given how few men were there in contrast to how big the castle was. The Night's Watch just could have come to a point of it's not worth having this gate opened, given how many men are here. They don't really have the manpower to watch over it, and so they could have sealed it even before this point, but it's not really brought up as that, because if Alysanne had also visited and said, well, what's the point of men being here if the gate is sealed? Yes, to have men on all stretches of the wall, but is it really worth it? So that could have been another part of it. And so the Night Fort was deserted, and the last manned men of the Night Fort would move to Deep Lake. And that is the end of really the Night Fort's history. We know that eventually it is visited by Bran and Samwell, and they use the Black Gate more or less. But that's it. The Night Fort kind of just stays on its own and is completely deserted. We also know that Stannis wants to make the Night Fort his castle of residence, which is quite interesting, because we do have the idea that George has told us that Stannis is going to burn Shireen. Is this going to be at the Night Fort? That's the one thing that I find to be really interesting. If we take Daenerys' vision in the House of the Undying, of her seeing this king that has no shadow, if that is Stannis, and Stannis becomes the new Night's King, the Night Fort will become a very interesting position given what's been foreshadowed about it and how Stannis wants to repair it, all that kind of stuff. Let me know what you guys think. This is already a longer video, and so I didn't want to dive into too much of speculating about its future, but what do you guys think about the Night Fort? Will we learn more about it? Will we see it again in the series? What do you guys think? I predominantly believe that if we get the Winds of Winter, I believe we will see the Night Fort again, whether that's through, Bran seeing the past in dreams and visions, or whether that's maybe Bran even going south of the wall and that's how he gets, past the wall again, or it is because Stannis goes there. I believe we will get more into the Night Fort. But thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.